You're watching the JJ Podcast. On Monday, 11th of August 2025, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong officially announced that Australia would recognise a Palestinian state. In this week's episode, we meet with Professor Gerald Steinberg, a prominent figure known for his work on non-government organisations and their impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is the founder and president of NGO Monitor, which scrutinises the activities and funding of NGOs operating in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Steinberg is also a Professor Emeritus of Political Studies at Bar Ilan University, Israel, and was kind enough to walk us through some complex history in the Middle East. We ask why Palestine said no to a two-state solution in 1947, discuss how Hamas feel vindicated by reactions from some Western countries, talk about how this statehood could physically happen, given they need to meet 4 important criteria, and ask Steinberg what he would say to those who genuinely believe that Israel are performing genocide and starving innocent women and children in Gaza.
Well, Gerald, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. I just really wanted to start off, obviously earlier this week, our Prime Minister made the announcement that Australia would recognise the two-state solution with a Palestinian statehood. I just wanted, as from your expertise, just to talk us through the significance of what that means and the decision that the Australian government has made.
I'm going to ask for your indulgence. I'm a professor. I taught thousands of students. I can't help but doing a little bit of historical introduction.
Absolutely.
My sense is when you have all these politicians and the Prime Minister of Australia and Foreign Minister Penny Wong were following a whole series of others. They were just joining the train. But my sense is that they didn't know where the train came from or where it was going. So a couple minutes about the history. Yes. Because to understand the concept, the artificialness of a term Palestinian state, you have to go back 100 years. I can go back 3,000 years. There's never been a Palestinian state. The term Palestine was invented by the Romans 2,000 years ago after they conquered and destroyed the Jewish state that existed, the tribe of Judah. Judea, it was called back then, with a big temple. That's where the Hebrew Bible, that's the whole story of the Jewish people developing and getting to Jerusalem, building it, all those things. That was the history. And then Jews revolted against Rome. Rome said, we're going to smash you. You're a terrible example for all the other areas that we conquered. And we're going to rename you Palestine and take almost all the Jewish people out and send them all over the world so they won't revolt. There were actually 3 very, very painful revolts for the Romans. All right, that's a little bit too long a history. But from then until about 100 years ago, a little bit more, nobody used the term Palestine. The Romans used it, and then after that, they were replaced by the Turks, the Ottomans, other groups before them. Again, I'm not going to do you the 14-week course. But so the Ottomans ruled and controlled this entire area of the Middle East. And what is now called Palestine, what Jews have continued to call throughout this period the land of Israel, where Jews continued to live and return to throughout this period. The Ottomans called it southern Syria. It was a backwater. It was never developed. It was a very small population. It was never a thriving area. Jerusalem was not a thriving city. Haifa was a small town. And that was about it. Jaffa a little bit. Beersheba had a few remnants, but that was about it. And then the British came in after the First World War, the British mandate, which then became a League of Nations mandate, and they reused the term Palestine. They actually used Judea and Samaria also as part of their geographic regional descriptions of Palestine. So this history is very complex and muddled. And when the British said to the Jews, we will now, there's a whole long story behind that, we will recognize the right to establish a homeland for the Jewish people in the period of the early 1920s, that period of time. That was really the origins of the Zionist movement for 20 years earlier, of returning to the land of Israel. The Jewish people can have a home and defend themselves. all of that stuff. And then people who were here, Muslims, some Christians, said, no, we don't like that. We're against that. They were supported by the Egyptians, the Jordanians, other people around. We're going to fight that. And they called themselves Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs. And the Jews were called Palestinian Jews. If you look at coins that were minted, postage stamps, all sorts of stuff, there were Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Jews. But there was never a Palestinian state. There could have been one in 1947, 48, when the United Nations said, okay, there's a big fight going on, people are being killed. We're going to suggest that there's going to be a division of the land, very tiny piece of land. We're going to divide it anyway. Half for the Jews, about half for the Arabs. And the Jews said, yes, we'll take it. We're going to call it Israel. Arabs said, we're going to get all of our allies, 5 Arab armies, to come and invade and crush this Jewish state. The Arabs did not declare a state. They could have, but they said no.
Can you explain why they said no at that time? Is it because having the divide was not good enough for them? They want all of it? Is that what it comes down to?
That's one basic element of it. It's actually a bigger picture. For Muslims, for Arabs, it's religious for Muslims. The entire area has to be part of Dar es Islam, the Islamic part of the world. It cannot be taken, what they say it was, we conquered, we took. And Arabs comes from the term Arabia. It was conquest after Muhammad coming up and taking all of this area. This is ours, they said. It's all one area. We're not going to divide between Palestinians and Syrians and Jordanians. And these are also artificial Western concepts, these lines of countries that were actually created by colonialists. The French and the British sat down and drew some lines back in the days when Palestine was first recreated Western colonialism. So it's a long answer. I got to be shorter. But yes, you're right. The goal is always, if you listen to the statements, whether it's Hamas or whether it's the Palestinian Authority that they want to run this state, we'll get back to in a minute, Fatah organization, Yasser Arafat, before he died, his entire political approach, philosophy, set of objectives was, we don't want there to be a Jewish state. This is all going to be Arab and Muslim. And that is throughout Palestinian society. So, and they say it all the time.
So if that's the case, then any country right now saying or pushing a two-state solution would be a complete and utter waste of time, because they're actually pushing for something that the Palestinians don't want.
I'm saying even more than that. It's not just a waste of time. It's counterproductive. It's going to inflame all those passions and violent emotions. They'll say, oh, now we see the world is on our side. They're going to give us a state. And then once we have a state, we can take over the whole area. We're not going to recognize two states. There's this slogan, a two-state solution. Well, you don't find many Arabs, Muslims saying solution. We want this state, and then we're going to take over that state, and then we're going to have a bigger state, and then we'll figure out where we're going to go from there. That's not a solution. So it's not at all clear to me and many of the people that I talk to and work with, what's going to happen if Palestinians have a state. We don't know what the territory is. What are they going to do with it? Peace and recognition and living side by side and all those wonderful fairy tale images, there's no evidence that anybody's buying that. So that's why I say counterproductive.
And Gerald, what is the feeling like on the ground in Israel? There's been a war going on now for almost 2 years. Is there the continued support for the IDF in Gaza?
We're a complex people. We're 10 million Israelis, of which about 2 million are Arabs. Some of them call themselves Palestinian Arabs, and they are divided, I think, 80% Muslim, 20% Christian. There are also some Druze and some others. We're a very complicated society. Of the 80% that are part of the Jewish element, the Jewish sector of Israel, 70%, 80%, the opinions are divided. Israelis are exhausted. Every Israeli is exhausted. We have everybody younger than me has served in the military, women and men. Some of them have been injured. They've all seen their friends, their colleagues, their officers hurt, killed. For the first few months, we went to far too many funerals. Any funerals is far too many for an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old. But there's also still the sense we haven't finished the job. What happens next? And there are still 50 hostages that are being tortured, and we've seen the pictures and the videos and the sick manipulation of these poor people. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate intimidation, humiliation. You're going to suffer, and we're going to show all of the people that are watching this in Israel how much we're going to make you suffer. It's an attempt to instill fear. So the war's not over yet. So that's divided. We're exhausted, but the war's not over. And is Mr. Netanyahu the right person, who's been basically running the country for so many years, the right person? Lots of questions.
And I guess that's one of the concerns that I have about countries coming out and talking about recognizing a Palestinian state, is more so about Hamas then have no need then to come to the table and negotiate regarding releasing the hostages.
They've literally said they're vindicated.
Hostages. Yeah. So I don't know if you've seen in Australian paper yesterday and today, there was reports that Hamas have said that Anthony Albanese's decision vindicated October 7, and they praised his political courage. Now,
he of course has run for the hills saying, "Oh, don't believe the Hamas propaganda." Now he's saying that.
So those have been the headlines here over the past sort of 24, 48 hours, where people are genuinely very concerned that Australia has a terrorist organization praising our government's decision to recognize their state.
And for good reason. That's not the company that you want to be seen with. You don't want to have your photo ops taken with a heinous killer and torturer, the sexual violence, the rapes. Those are all part of the October 7th and deeply ingrained. And they videoed it, and they showed it to the world to show how proud they were of what they were doing. I don't see the Australian political leadership, but beyond that, I want to go back to the point that this is a whole echo chamber, that they're just following the leader.
Exactly our concern. We see that in the world now, and I don't know how we go back from it.
I'm not an Australian. You're there. I'm not. I try to follow. I've been 5 times and enjoyed it each time. I have to say, I think it was in those days a wonderful society, and I think in many ways can still be. But I also know that most Australian political leaders don't have a very strong understanding of this part of the world. And they want to follow their peers. So what do we have? We have in France, Emmanuel Macron, who is hanging on with his fingernails to try to remain the president of France, even though he's lost complete faith among the vast majority of French citizens.
And he now has a massive Muslim population that have.
And he has right. He's got,
so it becomes a political thing.
That's very important. So he wants to appease them, wants to get the headlines, and wants to avoid his issues. And he's one of the people that got this train moving. And then you have Keir Starmer in the UK. He and his ministers and some of the members of parliament are constantly putting out statements in support of the suffering of the Palestinians. We call that, by the way, Palestinian victimhood. Palestinians are never responsible. When you hear about hostages, they say, of course, then they have to release the hostages, and that's the end of it. Yeah. But we have to give them a state. We have to give them food. We can't have starvation, which is also a fiction that's sold by the Hamas propagandists. But the food was being provided by Hamas allies. That's another Australian issue. I don't know how much money Australia has given to the United Nations, UNRWA, which is an entirely unnecessary, counterproductive organization, closely working with Hamas, with lots of members of teachers and employees of UNRWA, paid by UNRWA, are Hamas members. They're terrorists or members of the other terror organization. I don't hear any discussion of that in any of these countries, including in Australia. So there's this train that started with France, went to Keir Starmer, Labour government, then you go to Australia.
Yeah, correct.
So it's picking up bits and pieces. And it's also one of the things that's coming out now in the UK, just as in Australia, is major questioning about whether Starmer even understands the tiniest bit of what's going on in our region. Or are these partly, Britain also has a large Muslim population. They vote Labour.
It's for votes. It's exactly the same as Australia. Here. The same trend has followed. Mass Muslim migration into France, it goes left. They're never going to vote right. Mass Muslim migration into the UK, they're voting left. And we've had mass Muslim migration here in Australia. Over the last 20 years in particular, the percentages are outrageous, and it's having a drastic impact on our voting system.
It's also the violence that comes with it.
Yeah.
These mass marches are violent marches, and then they are accompanied by attacks against Jews, against synagogues, and sometimes not just Jews in synagogues. We saw that in Canada in the last, I think, 3 or 4 days in a number of places, Vancouver in particular, but also Toronto, Montreal. The big march in the Sydney Bridge was a threatening march.
Mm.
So even if they didn't vote Labor, they would say, we're going to cause so much violence and disruption. You don't want that because that's going to cost your political career. So let us do what we want to do, and we'll vote for you and we'll support you. Okay, that's the quid pro quo. Now, nobody says that out loud, but that's, I think, part of the thinking, no?
And that was what was so concerning for us as Australians when we watched that march across the Harbour Bridge. But to see, ISIS flags in amongst the crowd and Hamas flags, and someone was holding up posters of the supreme leader in Iran. And you look at all of those, and whilst they were trying to declare that they were marching for humanity,
burning the Australian flag in the
yes,
process.
true, they were burning the Australian flag in the process as well, and it had that death to the IDF on the back. And I was watching that and I thought, how can anyone in their right mind actually think that that was a peaceful protest or they're marching for humanity? Because there was no mention about release the hostages or anything like that. And I'm just curious for someone, you're in a country, Israel is meant to be an ally of ours. What's the reporting like in terms of the feel now of what people see Australians and
you would have seen
Australian
those
to
images.
be?
Yeah.
Well, you're not going to like this if you're an Australian, a loyal Australian. The image of Australia is quite bad. It's not different very much than France or Britain, but there was a sense, it goes back a few years, it goes back to previous governments, but there was a sense that Australia gets it. I remember days not that long ago when I do stuff in the United Nations. I'm one of those opposition people that goes and says that the Human Rights Council condemning Israel every other day for human rights violations and war crimes, and now you've got the genocide. It's just lies and propaganda. And Australia would always vote with Israel and lead. Australia took a very important role as a leader in trying to prevent the abuse of moral values and principles and democracy for demonization of Israel. And in the United Nations, you've got 55 countries that are part of the Islamic Organization of Islamic Cooperation. You got Iran and Syria and Algeria and Egypt. None of those countries have any human rights for their people. And they're very active in the Human Rights Council in order to, let's get Israel. Australia was very supportive. I remember you had an ambassador here named Dave Sharma, who was not just extremely well informed, that I would see him at so many different events and he would speak, and he was very much respected by the diplomatic corps here because he knew what he was talking about. He was able to analyze, and he constant stream of important Australian leaders, academics. We would have all sorts of events, and the distance was huge. I said I'd been to Australia 5 times, and that was a period where I was invited. The first time I was invited to Australia was by the Australian National University to talk about strategic instability in the Middle East. A professor by the name of Desmond Ball, very well known and highly respected. I can tell you my own personal experience of getting off a plane and coming from Israel through Hong Kong, I guess, and landing in Canberra in the morning and seeing this incredible life and the area all around the university. It's a whole other world. And the reception was very, very positive. We didn't agree on everything, but it was substantive. And that's my own experience in many other ways. And many other people that I know have had that experience. And our sense is it's over. People are afraid to invite us to universities, me and my colleagues. People are afraid to have serious conversations. We can disagree, but that's not there anymore. And we see and we hear from our friends, and in many cases, people have close relatives, the feeling among Australian Jews of threat, of being isolated. Yes, there are people who come and support them, and that's important, but the government's not there. And that's, Michael Danby is a friend and someone that I have known for many years, a member of the Labour Party, who doesn't share all of the slogans and myths, and he's pushed out. He knows more about, as far as I know, more about the Middle East than any other active labor minister or member of parliament. Nobody listens to him. And that's
very
to me,
sad.
that's very sad.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Gerald, is that when Anthony Albanese made the announcement this week about recognizing Palestine and giving it statehood, I suppose, the first thing I did was have a look at whether or not it could physically be done. I found the details of the Montevideo Convention, which was a treaty signed in 1933, which recognized 4 criterions in order to give statehood or have recognized statehood, of which were a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and of course, the capacity to enter into relationships with other nations. Now, can you tell us, can it actually be done? Does Palestine actually meet these criteria?
The 2 hardest issues are the territorial definition and also the broader structure of the society running a real government. Both of those are complicated. I'll try to make it relatively short. The territorial issue is extremely complicated, but I think that it's somewhat doable. And I'm very cautious in my words. I'm not saying it's impossible. Many Israelis disagree. Under ideal situations where Palestinians would accept not just a few politicians, but society would vote for those politicians and be part of that agreement. We're going to drop this concept that we've had since 1947 or 48 called the right of return, meaning we're going to come back to before 48. There will be no Israel. All those people who call themselves refugees after 77 years and 4 generations, and they call themselves refugees and they're given life support, food and education and medicine and everything else because they're permanent refugees, and that's victimhood. Well, are they going to accept that they can have the areas that were largely held by Jordan? That's another part of the history, right? Jordan in 1948 conquered and occupied what was part of Palestine that was supposed to be part of a Palestinian state. So those areas are somewhat defined. We're going to have a big problem with Jerusalem. If we solve everything else, we can solve Jerusalem. But we're not even close to solving everything else. And Jerusalem is extremely complicated because it has so much history, so many sacred locations for so many different people. The last time that Jordan conquered Jerusalem in 1948, Jews were not just Israelis. No Jews were allowed to enter where their sacred places are. The Temple Mount, where the temple stood from 2,000 years ago, from 3,000 years ago to about 2,000 years ago. It was off limits and very, very intensely policed. Jews who came from other countries, including famous Jews, were turned away. They were not allowed to enter those areas by the Jordanian police, which was actually acting on behalf of the entire Muslim and Arab League. So defining how you deal with that, that's going to be hard. The second aspect, can they run a state? In 1993, we had this big agreement called the Oslo Agreement. And that created something called the Palestine Authority or Palestinian Authority. Not a state, but a mini state. And they had a president. They still do. First it was Arafat, and he died. A couple of years later, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president, his successor, for a 4-year term in 2005. 4-year term, now in its 20th year. It's the entire Palestinian Authority that's supposed to be the creator of this state, that Anthony Albanese and others have said are going to be the ones who are going to fix everything, have a history, decades of corruption, of failure, everything. Everything has to be done either by the United Nations and an international body or by Israel. They can't do it themselves because they don't care. They're not interested in creating a modern functioning society. You can take a small territory like Hong Kong or Singapore, and potentially it can be a functioning state. Certainly Singapore. Hong Kong became much more complex with China, but Singapore is a very successful independent state. It defends itself. It feeds its people. It's got a huge, very high standard of living, makes high tech and all sorts of other things. Because their goal is not to conquer their neighbors or to destroy them. They don't carry this huge chip on their shoulder of being somehow deprived of what they thought was their land and all that other stuff that goes with the Palestinian mythology. They move forward in Singapore. Some Israeli politicians have said over the years, let's help Palestinians turn themselves into Singapore. I got to add one quick thing. We're all looking at Gaza, how terrible things are, how awful Gaza is. In 2007, the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, who was considered to be right-wing and hated just like Benjamin Netanyahu is hated now by the media and by others, and he decided that Israel needed to withdraw from Gaza and let that become a proto-Palestinian state. Every Israeli was pulled out. It was painful. People who'd lived there for 3 or 4 generations, kids who had been born and raised their own children there, they were all pulled out, forced to leave. And there were all sorts of court cases, and courts ruled, yes, the government can do this. Every Israeli soldier and military base was pulled out. Within 2 or 3 years, Hamas took over violently. They killed Abbas's Palestinian Authority police and others, threw them off roofs. It was a real violent takeover, a coup. The world didn't say anything. And then they began to manufacture and fire rockets at Israelis. Israel left areas, hothouses, and the structure, the infrastructure for an agricultural economy, advanced agriculture, which is what the Israelis grew in Gaza when Israel was there. Totally destroyed. Everything that could be cannibalized was used for making rockets to attack Israeli schools and children. How can Israelis say, how can we make peace with people like this? If that's what they're going to do? So when Anthony Albanese and everybody else talks about a thriving Palestinian state, a 2-state solution, it's entirely fictitious.
But also that indoctrination of hatred that Abbas has said to Albanese that they will stop indoctrinating hatred, but he hasn't been able to stop doing that in 20 years and to fund families of martyrs. I mean, all of that sort of stuff. I mean, how on earth you can suddenly get Albanese to convince Abbas to stop changing these things that's been going on for such a long time?
Not just Abbas, but everybody in the Palestinian hierarchy. They're very good at speaking in at least 2 different languages, and they've learned that it works. So what you just described vis-a-vis Australia, the same process took place vis-a-vis the Brits, and it wasn't just Starmer, much before him as well, and in Canada, and in the Biden and Obama administrations in the United States. They say they're going to do all these things. They put a little bit of infrastructure in, and then nothing happens, because in Arabic, it's we doing the same thing. It's our land. It was stolen from us. We're going to take it back by force. All means are available. And then you get to October 7th.
What would you say to them that genuinely believe that Netanyahu and the Israeli people are performing a genocide and that you are actually starving women and children in the Gaza Strip?
If people are open-minded enough so that words make a difference, and I'm not sure they are. I think there's been a lot of brainwashing. But there are people that I talk to who are genuinely concerned and interested, and they see the pictures of Gaza, and they see the suffering. They don't know the history, and they want to know. They're open-minded. And then I think there are important things that have to be said. First of all, a lot of what you're seeing and hearing from Gaza is propaganda. And it's carefully designed propaganda. In 2001, the United Nations, the same United Nations Human Rights Commission in those days, held a conference in Durban, South Africa on the end of racism, which was an anti-Semitic platform to attack Israel. And there you have 5,000, quote, human rights workers, human rights officials from groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and a lot of other groups that said Israel is an illegitimate state. This is in 2001, before anything happened in Gaza. Israel is illegitimate. Israel is committing ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid. You had that language. Now, nobody listened, and it wasn't something that echoed throughout the world. And they've been building on this. So the first thing I say is to people, please take into account the possibility, I'm trying to be gentle about this, that you have been propagandized, even brainwashed, because all the media outlets that you look at repeat this. They don't know anything, but they repeat one after. They have people who come and say, we're experts. But these experts have been saying this for 20 years. We are human rights experts. We are genocide experts. We are experts on warfare. There are some people who do not, some very genuine experts who do not agree with this. There, and you probably hear them, Richard Kemp, Andrew Fox, both have been very important military leaders in NATO and in the UK, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. And they know what it's like to fight guerrilla wars against terrorists and ISIS. a chance to explain why what Israel is doing is necessary for its survival, and it's not genocide, and it's not starvation. If it was genocide, there would be not just 10, 20,000 civilians killed in Gaza, which is unfortunate, but what happens in a war. And Hamas uses what's called human shields to try to maximize the number of casualties. It would be, if it was a genocide, we're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of people. There is no genocide. It is completely a lie, but it sells well. Some of the pictures we know are manipulated, like this very, very tragic picture of a boy who had a medical condition and was being treated thanks to Israeli assistance, but he was being sold as a victim of starvation. We have many examples of that, of false stories. So I ask people to be really careful about what they see and hear on the media, and check to see if what they're hearing is, can something, we use the term verifiable. Check it independently. And 90% of the news that we see coming out of this region is not verifiable, is not checked independently. It comes from Hamas, the Gaza Ministry of Health. That's Hamas. So the third aspect, if I get to this stage in the conversation, is look at the history and remember Jews are people too. What would you do if you were subject to the kind of attack, the atrocities, the butchery, the rapes, just the inhuman horrors of October 7th? I was at some events, diplomatic events that took place in Israel, where, and I believe the Australian ambassador and others were in the room at the time, and part of that was to show some of the pictures, some of the video of that horrible day of October 7th. And people came out crying and they hid their eyes because you can't watch that. It's inhuman. But what you can say is, this is not a one day, okay, we condemn it, and now we're going to condemn Israel because of the overuse of force, disproportionate use of force. What would you do in that circumstance? How can we prevent this? And where is the international community, in quotes? Why aren't you in there with us to make sure it doesn't happen again? You knew there were 500 kilometers of concrete tunnels under Gaza, where the hostages are now being kept, where all of this was being planned, where thousands of rockets were being manufactured. You were on the ground. You sent money. I know 2 Australians who came from an important organization called World Vision. And they came after they had a World Vision in Gaza, who was given 50 million Australian dollars, maybe in US dollars even, in aid. This was back in 2016, and was arrested because he was accused and later convicted of having given a large amount of that money to Hamas. And the Australians who came after he was arrested and sat with me said, we've been to Gaza. They showed us the fields where they used our money. This is World Vision. And I said, did they show you what was underneath the fields? We're talking about 2016, 17, not now. And they said, no, we couldn't ask about that. They knew that what was going on under the fields, everybody knew then there were structures being built, there were huge tunnels being built. Nobody imagined October 7th. Even I could not have imagined October 7th, even though I know that the warfare is ongoing. Nobody could. But they didn't want to know, they were afraid to ask. And all those people in Australia who say that the head of World Vision, Palestinian Arab by the name of Chalabi, who was arrested, tried, and convicted for having diverted 50 million Australian donated dollars to divert into Hamas, they kept saying he was innocent, that there was a fake trial. And yet the evidence, not all of it's been released. Some of it is based on protecting various people who came forward, whistleblowers. But some of the public verifiable evidence, the checks that were written, the financial records show clearly that Australian World Vision money was being transferred to Hamas, and nobody did anything to stop it. That's the approach that's got to change. You can't just throw money, say we're helping Palestinians. And I really, having met with the people from World Vision that were sent over from Australia to find out what was going on and to talk to people like me, I believe that they really didn't know, but they also didn't want to know. They really saw Palestinians as victims who needed to be helped, but they didn't look at the other side of what happened to that. That has to change.
Yeah.
Well, Gerald, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. And I just hope we can bring peace soon and get those hostages back.
Well, I really enjoyed, maybe joy is not the right word, but I think the questions and the discussion was something that I appreciated being part of, and be happy to continue this discussion.
We'll take you up on that.
Yes.
Okay. Very good to meet you, both of you.
Thank you for listening to the JJ podcast.